Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that to keep rising global temperatures below 1.5 degrees this century, emissions of carbon dioxide would have to be cut by 45% by 2030. Now it seems there's a growing consensus that the next 18 months will be critical in dealing with the global heating crisis. CIHT recently launched a climate change pledge, and climate change requires us to challenge conventional thinking and challenge orthodoxies. I can think of no better person to do this than with Nick Tyler, the Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL. I'm your host, Justin Ward. So, taking as a starting assumption that transport systems are there predominantly to support economic wealth, firstly, do you think this is an accurate assessment of the current position? And secondly, do you think that this needs to be challenged?
Thanks, Justin. That's a very, very interesting question. I think I would start from a slightly different place because I don't think transport is there for economic wealth. I think transport is there to enable people to come together and communicate and act together as a social species. And transport is one of the ways that we enable that to happen. On the back of that, there might be economic wealth. But I think if we think that the driver is economic wealth, that's a big mistake. And it's kind of associated, I think, with the climate change problem. Because when we talk about climate change now, actually the climate changed a couple of hundred years ago. And it changed then really as the result of, we can now see that it changed as a result of the sort of centralization of industrial stuff. So you collected people together initially for water power. You could centralize water power. You can have a big factory. You bring lots of people into work in the factory. You therefore have a city. And Manchester was kind of the first modern city that was how it was sort of came to be. That's 250 years ago. And ever since then, we've sort of been moving on a trajectory which has been to amplify economic wealth without thinking about other consequences, because that was seen to be the most important thing. And transport, because it requires the use of a lot of energy to move things and people around, is a great consumer of all that energy. And we didn't think very hard about how you produced it because we didn't need to at the time. And so transport, not surprisingly, actually is a source of a large proportion of the total energy use and emissions that get produced by it. And therefore we have a problem now in 2020. That problem's been coming for 250 years. If we were very smart 250 years ago, we would have been going, hang on, we need to think about this. But we haven't. And it's only really now that we seem to have slipped it over some kind of environmental threshold where we are seeing the impacts. We have been over the past few years, or several years, I guess, we've been able scientifically to detect the effects. What we haven't done is to convince the political world that there is a problem. But essentially the sense of driving the world through economic wealth is kind of why we're in the state that we're in. So I think one of the first things we have to do is to break that connection and think around how we live as a species in a way that does not actually have that kind of driver that pushes us down this path of consuming more energy and emitting more emissions and bringing on the issue of climate change. And I would argue that we are not going to get anywhere near those kinds of results that the IPCC is looking for unless we change at that level. We have to change the fundamental cause of what it is that we're doing to drive ourselves as a species. And I think getting it away from economic wealth as the driver to some form of more civilized, whatever that is, the word I always use is sociable. And I don't mean sociable in the sense of having lots of parties. I mean sociable in the sense of communicating, speaking with each other and collaborating and cooperating. These are the characteristics of Homo sapiens as a species that enable us to survive thus far. And in a sense, we've kind of lost that. And I think if we need to think of that as much more of a driver, and then once you think of that, then you start to realise that actually, well, maybe we don't need to be generating all these emissions in order to achieve that.
You mentioned about convincing politicians. One of the roles, if you like, of the Committee on Climate Change, you provide advice to government. They don't have to necessarily take on board the advice that they give to government, but they've said that unless progress is made by the transport sector, future carbon budgets may not be met. There's a clear challenge there that, like you said, we can't do what we've always done. And it follows on a bit what you've said before, but what change do you think is required on particularly surface transport in the UK to enable us to at least deliver on the carbon budget?
I think the kind of changes we need to be honest. Maybe that's a change, but we need to be honest, because actually at the end of the day, one thing we do know is that if you want to move a kilogram of stuff a certain distance, you require energy to do that. And that is a fundamental. We are not going to replace that. It doesn't matter what you do. You are not going to change that law. And that moving that mass, that distance, requires energy, and that energy has to be got. And usually that, because of the way that chemistry works, it's going to result in emissions. So there's a sort of kind of fundamental thing that is going to happen almost whatever we do. So the only real way, you can tamper with that. You can say, well, let's use this source of energy rather than that source of energy, but you're not actually fundamentally changing the initial thing. So even though you could say an electric car is zero emissions at the point of use, driving down the street, it's a zero emission vehicle, actually it isn't, because half of the particulates that come out of a car come from the wheels and the brakes and things like that, and they will have those things. So they're not zero emissions, first point. Second point is that it will be producing energy somewhere. So how is that energy being produced, and what are the impacts of doing that? And there will be better ways and worse ways of doing that, but it does rather depend on where it comes from as to how zero emission that car is. So fundamentally, we're only going to sort of tinker with the edges of this problem unless we actually deal with the fundamental thing of how many kilograms are you going to move how many kilometres. And unless we actually face up, and that's what I mean about being honest, unless we face up to that brute reality, we are only ever going to scratch the surface of this issue. And I think one of the things that the transport sector needs to do is to come clean with itself, possibly, but certainly with everybody else, politicians, the public, and so on, with that kind of reality. And the images that we have of how people move around, we have known for decades, have been absurd. I mean, you never see an advert for a car in congestion, and yet we all know that that's what happens to cars. But and that's just the same now, that we say, oh, look at this wonderful clean electric car. Well, not so sure. So I think we have to deal with the fundamental there, and it means that I think the transport industry, in the sense of the people in transport who are moving things around, who do the moving and so on, those people need to be much, much closer in their mindset with the planning people who determine where things are that you are going to be moving from or to. And with that, you can start to say, how can we actually see movement as something which we want to, in effect, discourage, in order to get a greater sense of accessibility to the things that we actually need and want in order to have a good quality life. At the moment, we have those two things tied together, that movement and accessibility are kind of seen as the same. And I think we have to break that, so that we see movement as something you want to reduce and accessibility is something you want to increase, and we figure out how we do that. And then because you've then separated out the physical movement of things or people, you've now been able to think a bit more about, so what do we do about the way in which that happens, and what's the impact of that on energy and emissions?
We've obviously looked at the UK and that image of the car on the open road and the freedom that buys, and that dream is sold as a global commodity that people buy into this dream, and it's something that, as such, the growth in vehicles across the globe is it took the first, I think, century for 1 billion vehicles to, and now it will take the next decade or something for the next billion to be there. Yeah. So the challenge globally becomes fairly enormous. So how optimistic are you for transport and engineering that it will either help or hinder action to combat climate change across the globe?
Well, I would have to say I'm very worried about that. And that's not because I think technologically we don't know what to do, and even the sort of planning thing that we've just been talking about. I mean, it's doable. This is not actually complex stuff to do. It's just having a will that these are sort of shifting the objectives a bit. But there is a real problem in that we have spent the last 100 years selling an image of sort of freedom of movement in the sense of being able to drive anywhere as being a mark of a developing society and so on. And what that image means is that you have many people around the world who currently have no access to such movement, thinking that that is actually what they need to have. And the difficulty, so if you go to, I had a PhD student looking at various countries with different levels of, I suppose, what we would loosely call equality, in the sense of economic equality, I suppose. Why is it that somebody in Amsterdam, or an Amsterdam-like place, is sort of happy to go around on a bicycle, and maybe they would use a car occasionally at the weekends or something like that, but a huge proportion of their journeys actually are done on bicycle or possibly on foot. But if I go to Bangalore, even the people, the very poorest people in the bottom end of Bangalore, if you talk to them about transport, what they want is a Ferrari. So how do we actually square that circle? Because if the people want something, even if they don't get a Ferrari, but what they get is a Volkswagen Beetle or something, that is still pushing in the wrong direction in terms of what we were talking about with trying to get a handle on the amount of movement that is going on across the planet. And I think we have to get into the psychology behind how those people are thinking in order to be able to do that. And I think that's where the big challenge is. But that's a massive challenge, I think, to do that. But I don't, because it comes back to the thing, if we don't actually tackle the amount that people are actually moving, if we don't actually crack that fundamental, almost physical law about that, everything else falls off the bandwagon. So essentially we have to tackle that. And I think in that particular kind of case, and so what we found in that work was that the more unequal a society was, the more you had this kind of problem. So your as examples only, but your Scandinavian, Northern European kind of countries are more likely to have people more accepting of bicycles and feet and things like that, and your Southern Hemisphere are more likely to have a sense of wanting to be in a vehicle that is not powered by feet or animals or whatever.
I'm being more optimistic because it was surprising and it was exciting. What was reported in the news this start of this year was that in Oslo, where there was no pedestrians or cyclists killed for a whole year, which, given the UN Decade of Action on Road Safety, is not achieved as much as people would hope. I think 1.26 million people are killed each year on roads. I mean, I don't know what the current figure, but it's in that ballpark. And so that's quite an achievement and credit to what they did there, I guess, by creating the environment that they created. And this is partly a bit about the vision for cities and how we create environments, given that 2/3 of the world population will live in cities soon. What do you think? Because you've mentioned we have an unsustainable system based on historical decisions made by humans around the world, which we now consider to be a legacy. You've said that. And how do we then deal with the fact that much of our city infrastructure has already been built? How do we then kind of move towards an environment where people can be more sociable? And
well, very interestingly, I mean, it's a Scandinavian country like Norway that has actually generated those kind of statistics, and so that's sort of interesting. And the great optimism piece is it shows you can do it, and I think that's terrific, and it's fantastic that we have that, because it's always worried me a bit that you can't sell how wonderful all that is unless you've got some sort of example there. I really hope it sticks. I mean, the trouble is when you get to zero, you haven't got to go very far to get off zero. So it's one is a sort of infinite increase. So I hope that we can that does stay. But you're only going to get to that point because people have changed their attitudes to how they relate to each other on the street, and so I think there's a very encouraging note there. But it does kind of, I think, reinforce what we're talking about here, that the way to overcome the legacy, because Oslo has the same legacy in many ways as London or Paris or whatever. I think, well, if you take a city like London, and I just say that because it's a city I know better, London's interesting because London started out as a pedestrian city. I mean, London is a walking place. If you go into the city of London, the reason it's all wobbly and so on is because it's feet that designed it, not wheels. And even if you go out of the city of London towards the west of London, towards Mayfair and so on, developed later when they were accommodating carriages, you see the curvature of the streets is opened out a bit in order to accommodate carriages because they're not as good at turning as feet. So you can see that sort of kind of thing happening. But we have that legacy. That doesn't mean to say you have to have carriages in your streets. I mean, you can still walk on a street that is designed for carriages. But I think the interesting thing is that we have to think about how do we use what we've got. 80% of the built environment in 2050 is already here, if not more. So we have to work out how do we use what we've got better, and that's why the attitudinal piece is important. So the sort of legacy that is tricky, we have in London a massive underground system, and that underground system over 150 plus years has been essentially about bringing people into the centre from the outside of London. And it's been extremely successful in doing that, to the extent now that it's operating well over its real, honest capacity, and still functioning more or less. Everybody is uncomfortable and it's not a particularly pleasant experience, and so on and so on and so on, but it's kind of working. But if you want to go from one suburb to another on outer London, that is actually very difficult to do on public transport. And it seems to me that what we need to do is to figure out how we use the infrastructure that we already have in those outer London areas in order to facilitate easier movement within the outer London areas without having to come into the centre. And then you can start to see how you shift your economy, or you distribute your economy more evenly throughout the city as a whole, instead of having it hugely compressed in the middle. So about 1.5 million people cross the Circle Line every day. And most of that happens between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning, and similarly in the afternoon. And that's, we have all of this effort. We're just building Crossrail to facilitate that, and I often wonder whether actually it's a shame that Crossrail is where it is, because actually it might have been better if you wanted to cross London, to do it around the edges rather than through the middle, because actually that would have been helpful in spreading that. And we know that works, because if you look at the overground line in London, when that opened up, that inner belt of London that it joined up, so the sort of Hackneys, Islingtons, Newhams, etc., suddenly you have people travelling from one to the other, shopping, working, living, and so on. And they now thrive. And that worked so quickly, they had to increase the capacity of the trains by 25% within 3 months of starting that service. So it's a huge benefit. If you were to do that another couple of kilometres out, I think you would be able to do that. So what that's all about is actually changing the picture of what the movement is. Instead of saying, yes, you have to commute 10, 15 kilometres into the centre in order to find a job, you're actually saying, I can move a smaller number of kilometres, maybe even in a walking, cycling mode rather than a motorised one, but we should make it easier with public transport. Some of that, if you want to do it with railways, that's infrastructure you're probably going to have to build. Overground was just joining together existing bits of a line that happened to line up. But out there you'd have to build more. But you could do a lot more with buses, and a lot more easily with bus infrastructure, simply by prioritising using what you've got a bit more creatively in order to create a much, much more coherent orbital route network, as opposed to the highly radial route network that we currently have. And that will actually then start to get people to, because they don't really want to get crammed in on the tube every day going into work. It's much more comfortable to travel more comfortably on the outer thing if it were there. And I think that is something which we could really do quite easily in a city like London, if we were so minded to put that into the political pot. And that's difficult. All of the mayors of London have concentrated on the centre. Congestion charge, the cycling, all of those sort of things that we credit mayors for have all been directed to the centre. The only thing that hasn't really was the overground. And I think they were quite surprised by that, to be honest. I think that was a bit of a surprise. But actually I think that's they need to push it out. Now, that's London that I know better. I think an awful lot of cities around the world have a similar kind of problem. The detail will be different, but a lot of cities were built on the premise of you have a city and it gradually grows in some sort of expansion outwards. Your transport systems, whether it's public or private, follow that and sometimes drive it. You build a line and in order to encourage it. I think those infrastructures we have and we should continue to use and we should encourage to use, and maybe we need to be more draconian about people using other modes like cars when there is a railway line that will take you in and out. But I think the quid pro quo of that is to enable people not to have to make that kind of journey, but to have their quality of life that they're really after, which includes some aspect of economic wealth, but actually it includes health, it includes enjoyment, it includes fun, it includes learning, it includes all sorts of other things that are not economic wealth. Let them be able to do all those things without having necessarily to go into the centre to the extent that they do now. Then you are in a position to be able to start moving that. And I think that's kind of where you can start to influence the travel pattern. That influences the way in which the travel is done, and that influences the energy use and therefore the emissions that come out of it.
Whilst we're on buses, I'm going to ask you a question that hopefully you'll know the answer to, so because it sounds like a slightly surprising question, but what's the connection in your mind of having a background interest in music and how this might be applied to how we operate buses?
Well, I think there's two aspects to this question. Okay, so the first one I would say is something I have found over the years to be increasingly relevant to me, and I think this is a good example of this, is the relevance that as a musician you realise very, very quickly that you do not produce very much of the music. So if you let's take just as an example, take a symphony orchestra. Nobody actually plays all of the instruments in a symphony orchestra, but you cannot play without all the instruments there. So what musicians learn very early on, and I'm not even sure they really learn it explicitly, but they certainly learn it, is that sometimes they are the most important person in that orchestra, and sometimes they are the least important person in the orchestra, and you kind of learn how you adapt your playing in order to meet that change. And you also realise that you can't play it without all of the instruments, so you need to be working with all of these different instruments with different capabilities and different qualities, and so on. Now, a transport system is a bit like an orchestra because it has all sorts of different components. And just like you can't run an orchestra without violins or whatever, you can't run a transport system without all the components of the transport system. So yes, you will need things like cars. You will need things like buses and trains and things like that. And the question is, how do you create your symphony? And getting the symphony to work harmoniously means that all of those different units have to work out how to fit together. And when one is prioritized and when another is prioritized is actually all part of that creation. And to my mind, what I find very useful, given that background, is to figure out very strongly how, if you want to design a transport system, it's the interfaces, if you like, between these pieces. How do they actually interact? How does the violinist and the oboe player synchronize in such a way when they're actually producing the noise in a very different way? So how do they synchronize those sort of things? That is kind of what you have to do with a transport system. So that's one way I would say that they fit. The other one, very different, is that we know that music is processed in the brain in a different part of the brain compared with things like words. This is a very, very lay summary, so let's keep it simple. And one of the interesting outcomes of that is that when you find somebody with dementia, they are often able to respond to music long after they have lost the ability to respond with words. So you can have examples of people who are essentially mute, but they can sing in a choir, including the words and things. And they can remember songs. There's all sorts of examples of this. So one of the things that we've been looking at in London is can we introduce music to, for example, the announcements on the bus that say where the next bus stop is? Can we have a tune for each bus stop? And in such a way that somebody would learn the tune for their bus stop. And most people actually don't use very many bus stops. They may use half a dozen or something like that. It's actually quite a small number individually. So you don't have to learn all 20,000 tunes for the bus stops in London. You'd learn half a dozen. Now, would that work is a kind of interesting thing. So this year we're looking at trying that out. So I think there's sort of two angles to the music question. Sorry, you asked sort of kind of, you said it's a bizarre question, so you get a bizarre answer. Yeah? I think there are two angles to this. One is actually the conceptual thing of what learning about music can teach you about how a system works, and a transport system is a very sort of interesting example of that. And the other one is how we process that neurologically tells us that there are possibilities for using that difference in order to be able to gain advantages. So in that case, the dementia people may well be able to recognise their bus stop and therefore live longer and more happily and contentedly in the community. But actually everybody else will also remember it better. And so I think there's a lot of scope there.
So going back to the original sort of focus was on addressing climate change and reducing carbon emissions, obviously the focus of the orchestra, I guess, in a totality is trying to create some kind of movement towards reducing emissions. So how you conduct that orchestra and how people interact in that orchestra, ultimately, I guess as a result, they'll be hopefully producing less emissions in their part to that, in playing their part. One thing I'm interested in, just as a kind of final but fascinating look forward, is the Person Environment Activity Research Laboratory, Pearl Laboratory, that's being built now, and it's due to open, I think, next year. And that has an aim of helping to design the next generation of city infrastructure. Given people moving to cities, as we discussed earlier, what questions are you seeking to answer through that environment? And then maybe touch on any elements that relate to the sort of carbon question as well.
Okay. Well, Pearl, person environment activities. So if you're a person doing something in an environment, you're kind of in the box of what we do in Pearl. So it's quite big in the range of things that it's studying. And it's about how people interact with the environment and how the environment interacts with people. So we see it as very much a sort of multi-way thing. So a lot of the work that we're going to be doing in there is about, for example, how does a design of something make it easier or harder for somebody to do that, and how do we know that? A lot of the stuff that is done in transport is kind of done without necessarily a lot of science behind it. And I know that there is a lot of science behind a lot of stuff in transport, but there will be things where you sort of think, actually, we don't really know why this is like this. And that sometimes gets into regulations. You'll have regulations on aspects of lighting, for example, and nobody knows why the regulation is whatever it is. And it may be that it's actually really quite perverse. So you take something like zebra crossings, where the requirement to light the zebra crossing in a way that makes it brighter than the road on either side of it, and you sort of think, kind of, why was that? Well, when we dug into it, it's because Philips at the time in the 1930s had 2 levels of bulb. And now we have that. So we now flood a zebra crossing with light. And you think, okay, that sounds like a good thing to do. But then it floods it from the top. So you light the top of a pedestrian's head, and the pedestrian themselves are now quite dark. And then you add to that the pedestrian is now walking across a striped surface. So from the driver's perspective, you have a dark object with a white stripe behind it, followed by the dark object with a dark stripe behind it. And in the several milliseconds it takes your eye to pick up the difference in that contrast, that pedestrian has disappeared. So a considerable proportion of the time that the pedestrian is crossing that crossing, the driver can't actually see them. On the other hand, the pedestrian thinks they are bathed in glorious white light, and therefore they must be completely visible. So they are sort of kind of quite likely to take a bigger risk in terms of walking out there, because of course they can be seen. And actually the regulation has made that perverse, and we know that that is the case because the neurology tells us that that is what is going on. So the one kind of experiment that we can do in Pearl is to test that. So we can build a street with a zebra crossing, with a car, we can change all the background lighting, we can put all the distractions in there, we can do all of this sort of stuff, have people crossing this road under different lighting conditions, and see if there are different ways of actually lighting a pedestrian crossing to make it safer, based on the understanding of the neurology that's going on in both the pedestrian and the driver, which we can see while they're doing it because of the kind of equipment that we have in the laboratory which enables us to do that. So that's one kind of example. There are many more. We're quite interested in one issue that comes up quite a lot is visually impaired people being able to see street signs, like the name of a street is quite important to them. It's quite important to actually quite a few people. Now, because of the way your spine or column enters your skull, you find it much easier to look down than up. And actually, it's very good. It's really brilliant for being able to rotate your head around so you can take full advantage of your width of visual field and so on. All sorts of really, and that's all because of evolution and blah, 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 all that stuff. Now, so you get to be a bit older, you're a bit stiffer, your vision is not quite so good, and your and possibly your cognitive processing is beginning to become a bit problematic. And in order for you to remember which street you're on, you have to look somewhere up in the sky, which is already physically difficult anyway, but actually it's not where you look. So we found somebody who was very happy in Belfast because they said, oh, it's really great. They put the road sign, the street name on the ground. The sign was on the ground. And a colleague of mine went out to have a look at this and discovered actually all that happens is the bracket had broken and the sign had just simply fallen down. But actually that was way easier for them to see where things were and what street they were in and what the directions were and so on, than to have the sign up where we normally put it. And then the question comes, why do we normally put it up there? And it's sort of kind of interesting. So that's another kind of thing that we can start to look at. So where should we put signs for pedestrians and what should be on them? Should they be symbols? Should they be what kind of font? All of those kinds of things we can study. Because we can create one-to-one scale version at size, so a 100-metre full-size street is quite a chunky piece of kit to have. Because we can test it, we can test it with people and find out what is actually working. And while they're doing that, we can study them down to the scale of neurons while they are doing those things. So we can begin to understand what is easier, what is more comfortable, what is proving to be quite complex for them to process as a piece of information, so that we can start to understand how to make it easier, more comfortable to be on the street and to be able to process through it. And I think to do that, to get that science behind it, you have to have a place like this. So we work with wide range of science, neuroscience a lot, neurology a lot, psychology a lot, orthopedics a lot, ophthalmology. We have a lot of work going on with ophthalmology, audiology. We're just putting in some work, some bids at the moment for work on balance with the Ear Institute, for example. So, how do we translate the medical view of these kind of issues as a disease? How do I diagnose somebody's hearing or somebody's balance or somebody's vision into, well, it may or may not be a disease, but actually they can't see green. So what do we do about that? That's the kind of interface that we're building with them. And it will open next year. Yeah.
And that's based in Dagenham?
That is going to be in Dagenham. So we had to find somewhere that was big enough for that sort of scale and flat enough to build it. So you're not going to do that in Bloomsbury unless you've got a really big budget. But so yes, it's in Dagenham, and that's really great because I think it's a very exciting part of London. We're taking the opportunity to try and use this opportunity because we're building. It's a brand new, purpose-built building. So everything about it is being designed because it has people, environment and activity. So this is very much about what that environment has to look like. So it's very much centred on bringing the community in and being open to this. It's not something behind locked doors. You bring the community in, and that, when I say community, I should really say communities. The local people, yes. Planning people, yes. Highways and transport engineers, yes. Architects, yes. All of these people, police, firemen, you bring it in. So we have inside there a 500-seat pop-up theatre so that we can show people the outcomes of some of this research. Because, you take that lighting example, the zebra crossing example, I could write 25 years worth of reports about the outcome of that experiment and still nobody would really figure out what was going on. But I could take them there, show them the difference between different ways of lighting in an afternoon. And then they will understand those reports. And I think we can get from sort of scientific idea to implementation for reducing those pedestrian accidents down to the Oslo zero much, much faster as a result of that, because we can show people what we actually mean. So it's an interesting combination of sort of theatre, scientific lab with lab coats and test tubes and wires and sensors and things, and fun and people.
Autonomous vehicles, I guess, in that environment. It'd be interesting to sort of, if there's anything on that. And also how the climate question relates to Pearl Laboratory.
One place where Pearl, I think, is going to be really important on this is actually electric vehicles, and by extension autonomous. Because one of the big problems with electric vehicles is noise, or the lack of noise. And there is a European directive now going to come out, I think, next year, I think it is, that they have to have a noise. I don't think they say what the noise should be, but it has to be a noise. I think that's probably a big mistake, but I think I need to read it in more detail really to know that. But where Pearl comes into this is, if you take an electric vehicle, I mean, I think most people would say the electric vehicle, take two equivalent vehicles, diesel version, electric version, modern vehicles. Most people would say the electric vehicle is quieter than the diesel one. But actually, when that vehicle is going along the street, it's not a lot different. I mean, it is different, but it's not a lot. And one of the things that I want to do in Pearl is to look at what are the components of the sound of a diesel motor that tell you that it's a diesel motor at the levels of noise that it's actually emitting. Because most of that, at those speeds, most of the noise is from the wheels. And they both have wheels. So it's not as simple as just saying noise. And I have this feeling that there's some component of the noises being produced by an internal combustion engine vehicle that is what we're actually picking up in our pre-conscious, that then drives us to look and find a vehicle. And if you're going to add a sound to an electric vehicle which is not making that noise, then why don't we just simply insert that noise into it rather than the noise of an engine? Because ultimately, why do we want to make the world noisier? There's no real gain in doing that. Adds stress, adds all sorts of stuff. So I'm sort of thinking, so where Pearl comes in is, yes, we can study so we can drive a diesel vehicle, we can see what the components of the sound actually are, not just what's the wheel, what's the engine, what's the gearbox doing, because that's got noises that come out of it. How do we actually, and a lot of the attention that's paid on vehicles in terms of reducing noises is on the engine, because that's where the bulk of the noise is. But I'm wondering, for example, if the whine of the gearbox is actually more informative. And we know that the huge proportion of mental processing of incoming data, vision, hearing, whatever, the huge proportion of that's coming in is processed in the pre-conscious that you're not aware of. And a tiny, 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 tiny proportion is in the conscious piece. And one of the pre-conscious processing parts is to figure out what you need to be aware of. And other parts of the pre-conscious processing parts is, what do I do with my foot while I'm walking along having a conversation with somebody else, and all those sorts of things. So I think we can use Pearl, because we can control all the conditions. We can use Pearl to start to delve into that kind of question and then come up with a far more wholesome answer to what the electric vehicle should or should not do. So that's one aspect of that. Another one is that follows on from that is which is, I suppose, not strictly the climate change thing, but it does get kind of muddled up with it, is the autonomous vehicle question and the extent to which how one controls an autonomous vehicle in an urban environment, in particular in a mixed space kind of urban environment. So where even if you haven't got what is loosely called a shared space, even if you still have a street like the one outside here with footways and cars, but people could still cross the road at any point and all this. How does the autonomous vehicle deal with that? Well, one of the first questions to ask, I think, that we don't really ask, because it's actually quite hard, is how does a human driver deal with that? Where is the processing going on that the human driver driving down a road, seeing a pedestrian walking along the footway, just has a kind of feeling that they might walk in the road. And they don't think that about every pedestrian walking down the footway. There's something about that one. So what is it that's picked them up? because the autonomous vehicle will not detect that unless we figure out what it is about it that we can do, and if that is then turned into something which the autonomous vehicle can receive as data. So understanding that issue around the data flow from the environment, which includes, in that particular instance, includes pedestrians doing whatever pedestrians are doing, into the receiver, if you like, of the driver, will help us to learn more about what we should be doing with the control systems for an autonomous vehicle. And if the autonomous vehicles are the way in which you're going to get more people into fewer vehicles, if that is the argument, which is very much up for grabs as to whether that's true or not, but that's kind of what one of the defences for them is, then we really do have to figure this one out, because if you put one on the road that waits for a pedestrian to go in front of it before it sees it, then either the vehicle has to travel incredibly slowly and therefore won't be acceptable to people, or it's going to be running people over. So Pearl can be, we are devising programs of work to go into Pearl to look at these kinds of questions. And the building itself will actually be carbon neutral. Okay. So including both the build and the operation. So we're quite proud of that. We managed to convince the university to give us some more money to do that. But yes. So of itself, that's also quite interesting of itself. So how does that actually work and so on? But that we will see. But I think I'm very pleased with that. And I think that's good. You're building a new engineering environment. It's a lab with environment in it. It should be carbon neutral, shouldn't it? And it's good that we managed to achieve that.
We're in the engineering department. What are the kind of game changers that you see that could be applied in the sort of technical engineering sphere for addressing climate change, reducing carbon, and so on?
Well, we do have a project looking at that for footways. Because if we want people to walk more, then let's make it more comfortable for them to do that. So we are looking at different materials for footways that are not concrete or stone or bricks or whatever. And that offers up all sorts of very interesting things that turn into, yes, it will make it more comfortable for people to walk, it make it healthier, they do less damage to themselves in walking, so they're not wearing out all their cartilages and bones and tendons and things, but also it's porous so that you're less tied up with having to deal with drainage, because drainage goes through it and you deal with the drainage more easily underneath it and so on. So there's a lot of interest in doing that and using that to sort of rethink things on materials. Now, what those materials are, reused, rubber, plastics, whatever, is a whole other question. Another area of work that's very interesting in this is the issue of the materials used in the roadway, where it would get much more wear than you get with the footway. And there was a thought, we can put some plastics and stuff into the roadway and that would be really good, but actually all you end up with is microplastics. So it's a really no-no. And so there is a lot of work, I'm not doing personally, but there is a lot of work going on that issue. Now, Pearl is part of a thing called UCRIC. UCRIC is the UK co-laboratorium for research on infrastructure in cities. And another part of UCRIC which is based in Imperial Manchester, Leeds maybe, which is looking more at the materials. And they are actually also talking to people here at UCL on what kind of materials are going to be good for roadways. Now, part of the idea of UCRIC is that if you do something like that in those institutions, actually we have to deal with how they interact with people before it goes anywhere else. So that will come into Pearl. Pearl will be a way of evaluating how that works for people. And so the question of materials, I think, is fundamental. Our footway materials work is actually part of a big Marie Curie European doctoral training program. 15 students working in 13 universities around Europe. We are doing the footways. Others are doing the roadways and so on in order to explore this issue. So it's a very hot topic. And yes, Pearl is absolutely in the core of it.
Well, thank you for listening to this CIHT podcast. That was an interview with Nick Tyler, the Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL.
So it works out we only had one ambulance. That's another one we're going to listen, because ambulance is very interesting, because ambulance, why do we have a siren on that ambulance? Is to say, I'm an ambulance, get out of my way, right? So the first piece it has to say is, here I am. And the one thing that happens when you hear an ambulance siren is you go, where is the ambulance? So it's completely failed at the first hit. And we're looking at some work that was done in the States, in New York, by a complete eccentric acoustics guy who died. But it's very, very interesting work. And he was talking about designing the shape, what he called the shape of the sound, about how it starts and how it finishes and things. And he could get ambulance sirens, because New York is full of sirens, he could get sirens to be quite distinctive and localizable. And so we're sort of, and I know we will get nowhere trying to convince the London Ambulance Service that they should make their sirens quieter. But what we can do is we can show how more localizable different sounds are in a complex laboratory, which we can then do inside that scale laboratory, and then maybe that we can convince somebody to try it somewhere in the world. That would be interesting. But yeah.